Priya Halverson, hands behind your back. The grant money, the equipment that was never installed, it's all here.
Of course it's me. This agency runs on what I did. Everyone knew. You want to prosecute someone who made this the only—
Priya Halverson operated without oversight for years as the executive director of an emergency dispatch agency in Belhaven, North Carolina. Thousands of residents depended on her to keep their 911 system running. Not one person checked.
1.4 million. The servers are still in the racks behind you.
She would not get the chance to explain. Within 48 hours, federal agents would execute search warrants at her home, her office, and the registered agent address of a consulting LLC nobody at her own agency had ever heard of. $1.4 million in grant money, a next-generation 911 system that existed only on paper, and a dispatch floor in Belhaven, North Carolina, still running the same outdated servers the state had paid to replace 4 years earlier. Every 911 call routed through Priya Halverson's agency for the last 4 years had been routed through equipment she had certified, in writing, no longer existed. Quick question before we go any further. How sure are you that when you dial 911, the call actually goes where it's supposed to go? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit the button now. This channel covers the cases that never make the evening news. Priya Anjali Iyer was born in Raleigh, North Carolina on October 14, 1977. Her parents had emigrated from Chennai, India in 1972. Her father, Venkat Iyer, was a structural engineering professor at North Carolina State University. Her mother, Lalitha, worked as a clinical pharmacist at Rex Hospital. The family lived in a brick split level off Lake Boone Trail. There was no money for excess, but there was money for books, for tutoring, for the kind of childhood that produced a national merit scholar. Priya was the older of 2 daughters. Her sister Anjali would later become a pediatric oncologist in Charlotte. But Priya, from a very young age, was drawn to a different kind of work. Her father liked to tell the story of the night the family lost power during Hurricane Fran in 1996. Priya was 18. She spent 4 hours on the cordless phone helping an elderly neighbor down the street whose oxygen concentrator had failed, coordinating with the Raleigh Fire Department, relaying instructions, keeping the woman calm. The neighbor survived. Priya did not sleep that night. She told her sister the next morning that she had never felt more useful in her entire life. She enrolled at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the fall of 1996. She majored in public administration with a minor in computer science, an unusual combination at the time. Her undergraduate advisor, Dr. Martin Greer, would later tell investigators she was one of the sharpest students he ever taught, with an instinct for understanding how public systems actually worked. She graduated summa cum laude in 2000 and immediately enrolled in the Master of Public Administration program at UNC's School of Government. Her first job out of graduate school was not glamorous. In 2002, she took a position as a 911 telecommunicator at the Pitt County Emergency Communications Center in Greenville, North Carolina. The starting salary was $26,400 a year. She worked overnight shifts, 6 in the evening to 6 in the morning, 4 days on, 3 days off. She wore a headset for 10 hours at a time. She answered calls about kitchen fires, car accidents, domestic disputes, suicide attempts, and at least one woman in labor in a Walmart parking lot. Her supervisor's evaluations from those years describe a young woman who was exceptionally composed under pressure, detail-oriented, and showed strong aptitude for systems administration. Within 18 months, she had been promoted to shift supervisor. Within 4 years, she was the center's training coordinator. By 2008, she was the assistant director. She met Eric Halverson at a regional emergency management conference in Wilmington in 2006. He was a network engineer for a North Carolina utility cooperative, 12 years her senior, recently divorced, with a quiet manner and a dry sense of humor. They were married in a small ceremony at the Carolina Inn in Chapel Hill on May 12, 2007. Their daughter Maya was born in August 2009. In 2014, the state began offering planning grants to encourage rural counties to consolidate their separate 911 centers into multi-jurisdiction authorities. The eastern North Carolina counties of Beaufort, Hyde, and Tyrrell had been operating 3 small, underfunded dispatch centers, each handling fewer than 15,000 calls a year, each running on equipment more than a decade old. The state wanted them merged. The counties wanted someone to run the merger. Priya Halverson applied for the job. She was 36 years old. She had spent 12 years inside the dispatch floor. She understood the work and the politics, and she could speak the technical language fluently enough to negotiate with vendors, and the bureaucratic language fluently enough to negotiate with the state. The interview panel offered her the position the same week. Starting salary, $84,000. Her title was Executive Director of the newly chartered Belhaven Regional Emergency Dispatch Authority. She built the agency, almost literally, from the ground up. She wrote the interlocal agreement. She negotiated the lease on the former Beaufort County Health Department building on East Main Street in Belhaven. She hired the first 18 telecommunicators. She designed the shift rotation. She drove to Raleigh once a month to brief the state 911 board on the consolidation. Within 2 years, the authority was handling more than 46,000 calls a year for a population of roughly 38,000 residents spread across some of the most isolated terrain in the state. But the work was harder than the outside world understood. Rural 911 in eastern North Carolina is not the 911 of a major city. The Belhaven Authority covered roughly 2,200 square miles of swamp, sound, farmland, and barrier island. Cell coverage was inconsistent. Many addresses were rural route numbers that meant nothing to a routing system designed for grid-patterned streets. A caller from a fishing boat off Ocracoke had to be located by a dispatcher who could read latitude and longitude faster than the caller could panic. The state knew this. The federal government knew this. And starting in 2018, a series of grants began to flow. The Next Generation 911 program, known as NG 911, was a national initiative to replace the legacy copper line dispatch infrastructure that most rural agencies still depended on. The new system was supposed to do 3 things. First, it would route 911 calls over an internet protocol backbone, which meant calls would no longer drop at the boundary between phone carriers. Second, it would integrate with mapping software accurate to within roughly 5 meters, so a dispatcher could see a caller's actual location instead of just a billing address. Third, it would include cybersecurity layers to protect the system against the ransomware attacks that had begun crippling smaller police departments across the country. For an agency like Belhaven, the upgrade was not cosmetic. It was the difference between a heart attack in Swan Quarter being located in 2 seconds or 20 minutes, between a hurricane evacuation that worked and one that did not. The grant funding came from 2 main sources: a state appropriation from the North Carolina 911 Board, totaling approximately $900,000 over 4 fiscal years, and a federal grant from the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, totaling approximately $750,000 for the same period. Both grants were reimbursement-based. The authority would pay for the work up front, submit invoices and certifications, and receive payment back from the state and federal programs. Both grants required the executive director, by name and signature, to certify that the funded work had been completed as described. Both grants relied on the integrity of one person at one desk in one small building in Belhaven, North Carolina. The state grant monitor visited once a year. The federal grant relied on quarterly written reports. Neither program had the staff to physically inspect every dispatch floor in every grant cycle. The system, in other words, ran on trust. It ran on the assumption that the executive director of a regional 911 authority would never lie about whether the call routing servers had actually been replaced. For Priya Halverson, that assumption would become the single most exploitable feature of her professional life. It did not begin with a plan. According to her later proffer to federal investigators, the first invoice was nearly an accident. In March 2021, the authority needed a small project management deliverable for a state quarterly report. A scoping document, roughly 20 pages, outlining how the NG 911 transition would be sequenced. Halverson had written most of it herself, on her own time, on weekends and evenings. The grant budget contained a line item for external project management consulting at a billing rate of $175 an hour. 2 months earlier, Halverson had registered a North Carolina limited liability company. The name was Meridian Public Safety Advisors, LLC. The registered agent address was a UPS store mailbox in Washington, North Carolina, about 20 miles from Belhaven. The mailing address on the bank account was her home address on Riverview Road. Her husband was not listed as a member. Her sister was not listed. No one was listed except a manager, identified only as P.A. Iyer, her maiden name. That March, she billed Meridian Public Safety Advisors against the state NG 911 grant for 42 hours of scoping work. The invoice totaled $7,350. She approved the invoice on the authority side. She signed the certification that the work had been completed. The state cut the reimbursement check 10 weeks later. The funds landed in the Meridian account at First Citizens Bank in Greenville. She told herself, in her later words, that she had earned it. The hours were real. The work was real. The fact that the consultant and the executive director were the same person was a technicality. She had not been paid overtime in 7 years. Therefore, the second invoice felt easier. And the third, easier still. By the end of 2021, Meridian had billed the NG 911 grant program for $148,000 in project management and systems integration consulting. By the end of 2022, the total had risen to $411,000. The invoices grew more specific. They referenced server racks installed. They referenced network switches configured. They referenced a vendor partnership with a fictional cybersecurity contractor named Black Pine Networks that existed only as a line on a Meridian invoice. In late 2022, the scheme expanded. Halverson discovered that a substantial portion of the equipment line items on the state grant could also be billed against the federal NTIA grant, because both grants had been written at different times to fund overlapping pieces of the same upgrade. She began submitting duplicate invoices. The same $40,000 mapping software license, billed twice. The same $87,000 bundle of call routing servers, billed twice. The same $120,000 in cybersecurity hardware, billed twice. By the time investigators caught it, she had double-dipped on roughly $400,000 of the total fraud. The money did not produce a lavish life. Eric and Maya never knew. The Halversons still lived in the same modest brick ranch they had bought in 2010. Maya, by then a high school junior, was riding a school bus to Northside High in Pinetown. The family drove a 2016 Toyota Sienna with 140,000 miles on it. What Halverson did instead was quieter. She used the Meridian account to pay off her parents' remaining medical debt from her mother's 2019 stroke. She paid off Eric's late ex-wife's lingering tax obligations, which had been pending against her husband by mistake. She set aside money for Maya's college tuition, which was projected to exceed $80,000 at the in-state school she was applying to, and she funded what investigators would later describe as a series of charitable transfers to a small mosque and a Hindu temple in Greenville, totaling roughly $36,000. The agency, meanwhile, continued to operate on its 2014 equipment. The legacy call routing servers, manufactured by a vendor whose support contract had expired in 2020, kept humming in their racks. The legacy mapping software, last updated in 2017, kept returning street grid coordinates that did not exist in Hyde County. The cybersecurity layer, in practice, consisted of a single firewall, no intrusion detection, and a shared password taped to the underside of a keyboard tray. The dispatchers noticed. Several wrote up incident reports about dropped calls, mislocated addresses, and a handful of cases where the routing system had connected a caller to the wrong county. The reports went up the chain. The chain ended at Priya Halverson's desk. The reports did not go any further. No one outside the building checked. No one inside the building had the authority to. In April 2025, the North Carolina 911 Board sent a routine grant compliance letter to every agency that had drawn down NG 911 funds. The The letter requested a final certification that the funded upgrades were operational and in service as of the most recent reporting period. Halverson returned the certification within 9 days, signed, dated, notarized at a Walgreens on Highway 264. She certified that the Belhaven Regional Emergency Dispatch Authority's next-generation 911 system was fully operational, that all funded equipment had been installed and was in active service, and that the agency was in full compliance with the technical standards published by the State 911 Board. Therefore, a state grant monitor named Diane Easterling drove out to Belhaven on the morning of June 3, 2025, to schedule a long-deferred annual site visit. It was supposed to be a brief stop. She had 4 other agencies to visit that week. She had been a state grant monitor for 19 years. She had never in her career encountered an agency that had lied about something this large. Easterling arrived at the authority's headquarters at 9:14 a.m. Halverson was not there. She was at a regional meeting in New Bern. The deputy director, a longtime dispatch supervisor named Coleman Pugh, gave Easterling a tour. Pugh did not know any of the grant details. Pugh did not know what NG 911 equipment looked like. Pugh assumed everything was fine, because for 10 years everything had been fine, because Priya ran the agency. Easterling asked to see the new call routing servers. Pugh walked her down to the equipment room, a converted closet at the back of the dispatch floor with 2 industrial server racks bolted to the concrete wall. The racks were full. The lights blinked. The air handler ran. Easterling read the model numbers off the front panels of the servers. She wrote them down in her notebook. She thanked Pugh, returned to her car, and drove back to her field office in Greenville. That afternoon, she pulled the NG 911 grant file. She compared the model numbers to the equipment list the authority had certified as installed. The model numbers in the rack matched the legacy equipment the grant had been written 4 years earlier to retire. The new equipment, which the authority had certified as installed and operational and fully reimbursed, did not exist anywhere in the building. She took out her phone. She photographed the rack one more time. She forwarded the photos and the grant file to the State 911 Board's Inspector General the same evening. The Inspector General forwarded everything to the FBI's Raleigh field office at 11:47 a.m. the following morning. The investigation was led by Special Agent Renata Cordero of the FBI's Public Corruption Squad, working with a forensic accountant from the U.S. Department of Justice named Walter Yee. They opened the case under file number 196A CE 1247088. Cordero and Yee spent 11 weeks reconstructing the paper trail. They subpoenaed the bank records of Meridian Public Safety Advisors, LLC. They pulled the registered agent filings from the North Carolina Secretary of State. They cross-referenced the Meridian invoices against the authority's general ledger, the state grant drawdowns, and the federal NTIA reimbursement records. They identified 73 separate invoices submitted by Meridian between March 2021 and January 2025, totaling $1,413,492. They obtained a search warrant for the home on Riverview Road on August 14, 2025. Agents recovered 3 external hard drives from a locked drawer in the home office. One contained the full QuickBooks file for Meridian Public Safety Advisors, including invoice templates that had been edited in real time before being submitted to the authority. A second drive contained scanned PDFs of the certifications Halverson had signed, organized by grant cycle, in folders labeled with the dollar amounts of each reimbursement. The third drive contained something else, a folder titled Project Notes. Inside were 41 Word documents, dated and time-stamped between 2021 and 2024. They appeared to be diary entries. They appeared to be Halverson writing to herself. One entry, dated November 19, 2022, read, "Submitted Q3 invoice today, $46,000. They will pay it in 8 weeks. I keep waiting for someone to ask a question, and no one ever does. I don't know if that means I am good at this, or if the system is broken, or both." Another entry, dated February 8, 2024, read, "Maya asked tonight what I do at work. I told her I help make sure 911 calls go through. I do not know how to live with the version of that sentence that is true. Agents also seized Halverson's work phone. The forensic extraction recovered a text message thread between Halverson and a vendor sales representative from August 2023. Vendor Repeat, August 11, 2023. Priya, following up on the quote for the routing servers. You said you wanted to schedule install for Q4. Are we still on? Hold off. Budget situation has changed. I'll be back in touch. Vendor Repeat, October 6, 2023. Hey, checking in. Should I requote for next FY? No, we are going a different direction. Please remove me from the prospect list. The different direction was a phantom. There was no other vendor. There was no install. There was only the legacy equipment still humming in the rack and the grant money flowing into the Meridian account. The smoking gun, in the end, was Diane Easterling's site visit photograph. The dispatch floor, the server rack, the same outdated, replaced call routing servers, fully reimbursed twice over, with a manufacturer's label still visible on the front panel, reading a model number that the grant program had funded the agency to retire 4 years earlier. We are about to head into the courtroom on this one. Before we do, I want to know what hits hardest about this case for you. The double billing, the diary entries, the fact that this went on for 4 years with no one inside or outside the building asking a single question. Tell me in the comments. And if you appreciate this kind of coverage, subscribe. We do these every week. Federal agents approached Priya Halverson on the morning of August 14th, 2025, at 7:22 a.m. She was in the kitchen of the Riverview Roadhouse, packing a lunch for her daughter. Eric had already left for work. Maya was upstairs in the shower. 2 agents knocked. A third stood at the back porch. Cordero identified herself, presented the search warrant, and asked Halverson to step outside. The body cam footage from one of the supporting agents picks up at 7:23 a.m. Ms. Halverson, we have a search warrant for the residence and your office at the dispatch authority. Agents are at the office now. We need you to come outside and speak with us. Can I tell my daughter? She's upstairs. She doesn't know. We'll handle that. Step outside, please. She stepped onto the front porch in a gray cardigan and bare feet. She did not cry. She did not argue. She stood for nearly a full minute looking at the agents and at the unmarked vehicles parked at the end of her driveway. The body cam recorded her hands. They did not shake. Ma'am, do you know why we're here? I think I do. Can you tell me? Meridian, the invoices, the system. Yes, I want to talk to my husband first, and I want a lawyer. She did not speak again until her attorney arrived at the federal building in Greenville 6 hours later. The proffer session that produced her later admissions did not take place until February of the following year. But on the porch that morning, before the lawyer, before the proffer, before the indictment, she said one more thing. The body cam picked it up clearly. She said it almost to herself, looking past the agents toward the magnolia tree at the corner of her yard. I knew this was coming. I've known for almost a year. A federal grand jury in the Eastern District of North Carolina returned an 11-count indictment against Priya Anjali Halverson on November 6, 2025. The counts included federal program theft under 18 U.S.C. Paragraph 666, wire fraud, false statements to a federal grant program, and aggravated identity theft related to the use of a fictional vendor name on submitted invoices. Her defense attorney was a former assistant U.S. attorney named Carmen Boudreau, retained from a Raleigh firm. Boudreau did not contest the underlying facts. The paper trail was, in her own words to the court, incontestable. Instead, she negotiated a plea agreement that allowed Halverson to plead guilty to 2 counts, federal program theft and wire fraud, in exchange for a recommendation at the low end of the federal sentencing guidelines. Halverson pleaded guilty on February 19, 2026, in a federal courtroom in New Bern. She wore a navy suit. She read her allocution statement from a single sheet of paper, her voice steady, her hands folded on the lectern. She admitted to every material element of the scheme. She admitted that she had submitted fraudulent invoices. She admitted that she had certified, falsely, that the work had been completed. She admitted that the legacy equipment had remained in the rack the entire time. She did not, in her allocution, ask for sympathy. She said, in her own words, that the agency she had built had failed the residents it existed to serve, and that the failure had her signature on it. Sentencing took place on May 14, 2026. The presiding judge was the Honorable Thomas R. Galligan, a 15-year veteran of the federal bench. 3 witnesses spoke at the sentencing hearing. The first was Diane Easterling, the state grant monitor, who described the moment she realized what the model numbers on the rack actually meant. The second was Coleman Pugh, the deputy director, who told the court he had trusted Halverson completely for a decade with everything I had, and I was wrong to. The third witness was a woman named Verna Whitehurst, a 68-year-old retired teacher from Englehart, North Carolina. Her husband had suffered a stroke at home in March 2024. She had dialed 911 and waited on the line for what she later estimated as 4 minutes while the call bounced between county routing tables before connecting to a dispatcher who could send an ambulance. Her husband survived, but with significant permanent impairment. She did not blame Halverson for her husband's stroke, but she told the court, looking directly at the defense table, that she had spent 20 months wondering whether the 4 minutes would have been 4 seconds in a working system. Judge Galligan delivered his sentencing statement from the bench. He spoke for nearly 11 minutes. The portion the court reporter would later place at the top of the transcript read as follows. This was not a crime of impulse. This was not a crime of desperation. This was a crime constructed, line by line, signature by signature, over a period of nearly 4 years, by a public servant who understood better than almost anyone in this courtroom what the consequences of her conduct could be. The defendant did not steal from a corporation. She did not steal from a faceless agency. She stole from the system that exists, for one purpose and one purpose only, to make sure that when a citizen of this state picks up a telephone in the worst moment of her life, someone answers and someone helps. The defendant left that system hollow. She did so deliberately. And she did so while standing in front of state and federal officials and looking them in the eye and certifying, in writing, that she had not. He sentenced her to 51 months in federal prison, 3 years of supervised release, and $1,413,492 in restitution. The Bureau of Prisons designated her to the Federal Correctional Institution at Aliceville, Alabama, a low-security facility for women. Her projected release date is November 2029. The Belhaven Regional Emergency Dispatch Authority began the actual NG 911 upgrade in September 2026, funded by an emergency state appropriation and overseen by a court-appointed compliance monitor. The new call routing servers were installed in January 2027. The old equipment was finally removed from the rack on a Tuesday morning by a contractor from Greenville, while a dispatcher named Marisol Aguilar took a call from a woman in Swan Quarter whose husband had collapsed in their driveway. The call routed in 2 seconds. The ambulance arrived in 11 minutes. The husband lived. Priya Halverson will be 52 years old when she walks out of Aliceville. Her daughter Maya will be 20. Eric Halverson filed for legal separation in October 2026. The Riverview Roadhouse was sold the following spring. The agency she built still bears the name she chose. The dispatch floor still hums. The calls still come in. And somewhere on a state evidence shelf in Raleigh, there is a photograph of a server rack with a model number on the front panel that was never supposed to be there. This case was difficult to sit with, but the case on the right-hand side will leave you genuinely shaken. Click it now.